Hello and welcome to this screencast presentation for development and sustainability. My name's Anna Hawkins and the theme of this week's session is consumption as a development and sustainability issue. So the Sustainable Development Goal that closely links to consumption, although I would argue that quite a lot of them do actually. If we look at things like the wider impacts of consumption, quite a few of the goals link to that. But goal number 12 is specifically naming consumption and production in terms of targets. So some of the headlines from the Sustainable Development Goal number 12 in terms of the drivers for why we need to look at consumption on a global scale. One here relates to the amount of food waste that's produced in the supply chains globally. One here relates to the amount of energy that we use using just in sort of everyday consumption forms in terms of things like lighting. And it points to this really important kind of headline really around consumption, which is if the current projections in terms of population size continue and everybody consumed in the way that people in the countries like the UK expect to consume, then we would need far more than one planet. We need three planets, but if everyone consumed at, say, the level of somewhere like North America, we'd be looking at more like 4 to 5 planets. So what I want to talk to you today about is consumption and sustainability is an everyday issue. So we're not talking about the big one-off purchases of a lifetime, like a big sort of a cruise or a sort of international travel, or those things have huge impact. But I'm particularly interested in my research around the impact of everyday consumption as a sustainability issue. In countries like the UK, which for the sake of kind of ease, we're going to refer to as westernized. So I don't really like the kind of developed and developing terminology, but we might use that as well. But in this kind of idea of a westernized lifestyle, so I'm thinking about countries like the UK, large parts of Europe, particularly Western Europe, and North America, Australia, places like that. So where we have this kind of ideal level of consumption that's very, very resource intensive. So just that everyday lives, the expectations of how we live our everyday lives are very resource intensive. What we tend to do as well is what we call externalize the environmental issues. So rather than see them as embedded in our everyday choices and our everyday lifestyle expectations, we sort of see them attached to these big issues like long haul international travel or buying a new car. And as I say, those things aren't to be ignored, but the way that we expect to live our everyday lives is a huge driver of globalized issues in terms of environmental sustainability and social equity. So as already mentioned, consumption at the rate that we expect to consume at the moment, if everybody consumed the way that people do in the UK, then we'd need 3 planets to support us. And this is really drawing attention to the fact, and I'll come back to this throughout the presentation, that consumption is an issue of equity as well as just a problem. So not everybody is consuming at the same problematic level. We particularly need to look to ourselves in terms of how we consume and how we expect to live. And we also can no longer just work under the assumption that the way that we live is actually aspirational. And that's something that everybody should in the world should be able to live the way that we do and consume the way that we do. If anyone has to change here, it's really people in countries like the UK and North America. So there are huge geographical disparities. I've already mentioned the kinds of countries that I'm thinking of in terms of overconsumption and high consumption, although within those countries, obviously, there's huge inequality as well. So we're not looking at countries where everybody is maintaining a fantastic quality of life. We're looking at really disparate levels of consumption within those countries. But generally speaking, there are large geographical differences in terms of who produces and who consumes and who produces the most waste. So in terms of things like water usage, energy usage, material usage, so sort of minerals, products in the petrochemical industry, the production of pollution and waste, and levels of health and well-being, we're looking at huge geographical disparities. And consumption is an issue, as I say, of development equity as well as environmental impact. Essentially, the headline from this is that modern lifestyles, as we expect to live them in countries like the UK, are inequitable and unsustainable. So it's not only that there is an environmental impact to the way that we live, but the way that we live could not be shared equally. Everybody could not live the way that we live under the current conditions. But rather than, as I say, we need to kind of flip the message on this one a little bit. So historically, when I started sort of teaching issues around consumption and development, there was this kind of expectation that in the developed world, as we referred to it then, we had this fantastic level of comfort in terms of our everyday lifestyles, and it wasn't fair to ask the developing world to not try and catch up with us. So we maintain this very high level of consumption. We expect everybody else to maintain a low level of consumption. So what's interesting to recognise when we're sort of talking about sustainable consumption is actually we have lessons to learn because we need to reduce our consumption. So we actually look to countries where lots of people consume at a far more sustainable level already through necessity. And actually maybe rather than saying how do we help these people to consume in the same level as us, it's how can we learn to consume in a more sustainable way, as is still going on in other parts of the world. So this author, Manisha Anantharman, writes a lot about this issue of kind of lifestyle leapfrogging, as she refers to it. So rather than developing countries just carrying on the path of sort of environmental destruction that countries in the developed north have gone on, then actually they could find better ways of living and better ways of consuming that kind of cut out a lot of the mistakes that we've made. So this is really drawing attention to the fact that we are not looking at, when we talk about problematic consumption, we're not saying that everybody's consuming at a problematic level. And we need to recognise as well that sustainable consumption in countries like the UK and North America is kind of badged as a sort of privileged lifestyle option. So people can choose to drive an electric car, or they can choose to have solar panels on their home, or they can choose to buy organic food. And that is not a choice that everyone has to make. But sustainable consumption is actually a daily necessity for most people on the planet. So the vast majority of people who have very little income and have to live a relatively simple life are actually already consuming at a sustainable level. One little example, the picture I've got here is of a food cart in India, and this is a really good example of, often when we're looking at one of the issues I'm going to talk about in a bit is the impact of food and diet on our consumption and our environmental footprint. And if you look to countries like India, actually the food supply chains there are far more sustainable. The dietary norms are far lower in the kinds of things that have a high impact in terms of carbon footprint, like meat and dairy. So this is a street food cart in India, full of delicious looking probably mainly vegetarian food, although it won't all be necessarily, but a significant proportion of that will be. In certain parts of the country, it would be. So as I mentioned, one of my main interests in terms of my research is really this idea of habit and norm. So what we expect to do because it seems normal, and the habits that we get into, and the impact that that has upon consumption. So this is a little quote from a sociologist called Elizabeth Shove, and there's quite a few of her sources that I've referenced in this presentation. But Elizabeth Shove really looks at how the habits and patterns of everyday life have changed over time to become more resource intensive. So an example, I'll talk about a few examples, but the images on this slide here show the sort of contrast between household laundry day in probably, I'm looking at that picture, it's probably like around 1905, although that would have been how laundry was done they're using those methods for a very, very long time. you would heat the water up on a range and you do all the washing by hand. Huge amount of work, mainly for women, almost entirely for women. Um, you'd have a whole day just doing the laundry. And nowadays, of course, most people have electric washing machines and possibly even tumble dryers in their home. Again, certainly in North America, the expectation would be most people would have a tumble dryer. Now, not everyone does, and you may not have one in your home, but you may have one in your student halls. I'm not sure. So what this means is that not only has the way we wash our clothes has become more convenient, far less labour intensive, and in many ways, that's a really good thing. But what's happened alongside that is that because it's less labour intensive, we do far more of it. So when it took a whole day to do the washing, you just washed things once a week. You wore them a few times before you put them in the wash, and now it's so easy that we wash our clothes far more often, and that has a resource implication in terms of water and materials and chemical pollutants and everything else. But it's important to recognise that a lot of these choices, as we see them around the way that we consume in our everyday lives, are actually fairly fixed. So most of us don't have a huge amount of choice about, say, things like the water infrastructure of our home. So even if we wanted to live the most environmental life that we could and have something like a composting toilet and we recycle our rainwater and everything else, actually most of us don't have the option of doing that, especially if we live in small properties in the city, if we live in a flat, or if you live in, built up area where you can't have a composting toilet in your garden. So a lot of the infrastructure and the way that we live kind of locks us into things. So in the UK, for example, our water system, we have one water supply into our homes that provides us with drinking water, but it also provides us with the water that we use to flush our toilets and wash in the bath. Just that, we use very high grade, potable, as we call it, drinkable water to flush our toilets in the UK. That's not the most sustainable way of using water, but most of us don't really have an easy option out of that at the moment. It would take some big infrastructure changes. So carrying on with the theme I mentioned earlier with washing clothes, we could also look at the example of showering. So a lot has changed in terms of our kind of personal grooming habits over the last, probably, we're talking probably over the last sort of 60, 70 years, really. But within my lifetime alone, so in the last kind of 40 odd years, this has also changed a lot in the UK. So a power shower pumps between 20 and 50 litres of water per minute. So if you have a think about how long you may spend in the shower and calculate the amount of water that a shower is taking, and then think about how many times you may have a shower, you start to see that there's a huge resource implication in showering alone. So now average showers, according to the research here, will last between 7 and 8 minutes, although I would probably argue that from speaking to my students over many years, they take quite a lot longer than that. So in the UK now, showering is a daily activity. Most people shower every day. Some people shower more than once, depending upon if they've been to the gym or been for a run or something else. Again, thinking about the changes over time, this is how we used to wash ourselves. So the top image there is a washstand, which is a jug and a bowl, and you would bring up warm water from the kitchen and put it in someone's bedroom. That was in kind of a middle class or an upper class households. The image at the bottom there is a man washing. I think he's probably an underground coal miner, so he's washing in a tin bath in front of the range at the end of the day, screened off there, a modesty screen. But this is how people washed. And actually, my mother's generation, she grew up in South Wales in the early 1950s, and this is how they washed them. They didn't have an indoor plumbing until she was around 10. When I was a child, we washed at the sink every day. We had a bath once a week. So that was entirely normal. We would kind of sponge ourselves down a bit, certainly wash our faces and our hands and everything else, and then we'd have a weekly bath. That was completely normal. So not only are we increasing the amount of water that we're using by having these power showers that last quite a long time every day, but we're also increasing the huge amount of product range that goes along with that. So that all the shampoos and the conditioners and the soaps and the detergents and everything else is going into the water supply. And so there's the energy embedded in the production of those materials and the packaging, but then also the issues around the disposal and the pollution that they cause. So if you just step back and just calculate really what's changed, in terms of resource consumption around something that the normal way of washing 100 years ago compared with the normal way of washing today, and huge resource implications in those changing habits and norms. But all we're doing is trying to fit in with what appears normal for our time. I'm making the case really, and a lot of the literature on consumption makes the case that we are not able to just kind of chip away at the edges of this. We need some fairly fundamental change. We can't actually continue with this level of consumption. With a growing global population, something's got to give. We could think about making technical tweaks to the existing system, but sometimes those make matters worse. So, for example, there's some evidence that shows that when you increase the energy efficiency of electrical products, for example, what sometimes happens is that people just use more of them. So because they know, say, a light bulb isn't really using that much energy, they just leave the lights on all the time rather than thinking, actually, I better turn that off because it's costing me some money. The image I've used here as an example of what I would call chipping away is this idea for improving, people's energy awareness around their shower. So rather than implementing any big structural changes, you have this little visual on your shower that basically says what the temperature is, how much water you've used, and the worse your consumption behaviour is, the more that the iceberg erodes underneath that poor polar bear until the polar bear drowns. And it's very sad about the polar bear, but also what do you think would happen if you had this in your bathroom? Would it radically change the way that you consume? Do you think, or is it actually just kind of leaving everything in place structurally and just hoping that it can kind of guilt trip you into having a shorter shower? Not convinced myself that that's going to have a huge impact. I want to kind of finally talk to you about food, because food is one of, again, my kind of research interests. So I'm sure many of you already know that food consumption is one of the biggest drivers of climate change in terms of things like carbon footprint, but also things like land use changes and water use and everything else. So it's a huge environmental impact. And what we know is that if we reduce, for example, meat and dairy consumption levels, then we could have a significant impact not only upon emissions from the agricultural processes and the processing of the food, but also the amount of land that we need for food production, because animal agriculture is enormously hungry, land hungry. So you have to produce the crops to feed the animals, and you have to rear the animals, and it's not a very efficient way, really, of feeding a growing population. There are quite a few drivers of the sort of problems around food consumption. So big changes in people's income levels and population levels, the process of urbanization, having a big globalized agricultural food system, and many others that you can see here as these kind of big structural drivers of why we're changing what we're eating and why our diets are becoming so much more problematic. So what we call a nutrition transition, which is like a catchy term. It basically means that the normal diets, things that people have, some norms around food consumption that were generated in countries like the United States of America and the UK, around kind of excessive consumption and cheap and easily available meat and dairy and high sugar and highly processed products. That's becoming normal as part of this globalized food supply chain. And that's having some serious impacts, not only upon the environment, but also upon things like our health and well-being. So we're starting to see lots of negative outcomes of our dietary norms, including health outcomes, diseases, non-communicable diseases, food monocultures, loss of biodiversity, and it goes on and on. So meat and animal product consumption's on the rise. so is the consumption of highly processed sugar, and a lot of the drivers of this kind of highly processed food is actually that food's lifespan is increased dramatically if you increase things like the level of sugar and fat in it. So as well as making food more desirable and almost addictive, a lot of these kind of highly processes are there to extend the lifespan of food so it doesn't go off, so you have a more stable global kind of product. So if you look at things like the images I've chosen here, um, there's one from a popular fast food chicken chain and another generic picture of a super sort of mega shake. And actually, this is where our consumption's going. It's pushing things to fairly extreme levels and constantly upping the ante in terms of how much bigger can we go, how much more exciting can we go, how many things can we stick on a milkshake to increase people's like excitement around food. But the impacts of this not only upon our health but also upon sort of global food infrastructure and agricultural infrastructure is enormous and really problematic. So things like calorie density, um, making foods more, packed with calories through increasing sugar and fat, makes foods more palatable and desirable, but also extends the lifespan. So it really plays into the desire of these global food supply chains to kind of maintain this very stable stock they can just sell over a long period of time across many, many countries. There's also strong connections between agricultural production and the oil industry. So fertilizer production, many fertilizers that are used in agriculture come directly from petrochemical processes, from oil, crude oil. Farming methods to farm on a really industrial scale, you need heavy machinery. So that has huge implications both in terms of the production and manufacture of that machinery, but also obviously the fuel to drive it. Storage and transportation costs of a globalized food industry where you're not just producing food and selling it in the local environment, you're producing food and then it's going into a global supply chain where it can be moved around and processed in a number of different ways in a number of different places and stored in between all of those different stages of the process as well. That has a huge resource implication. And of course, the one that we tend to think of as consumers is around packaging, but in that does have an implication. Lots of plastics are made from the petrochemical processes, from crude oil, but really that's the end of a chain, and it's got huge implications further up the supply chain. 70% of global freshwater is used in agricultural purposes, and that number is probably going up all the time. So this was from 2011, but this is probably more now. So yeah, modern day intensive agriculture is incredibly water intensive, and as climate changes, the areas that are sort of most naturally kind of designed for agricultural processes, so you end up with desertification, so you end up with areas where you have to artificially water crops and irrigate crops in order to keep them going. That's huge. So it has a huge implication for water consumption. So there's lots of issues there that I've talked about just to introduce these concepts, but I'd like you to obviously go away and think about these things and do some reading around them if it's an area that you're interested in. I pick up this subject in modules in the second and third year as well. So in summary, to leave you with, the way that we live our everyday lives is changing, and the way that we expect to live have huge resource implications in terms of the way that we consume both materials and energy. Consumption is an issue of inequality. So if we're looking at global patterns of consumption, we have to recognise that many people are already consuming at a sustainable level. Some people can't consume at a sustainable level and are falling below that. But it's particularly people in advanced economies on higher incomes who really need to think about changing their levels of consumption. So not only is overconsumption having a significant environmental impact, but there are many ways in which it's impacting negatively upon our physical and mental health as well. So lots of anxieties around consumption, but also lots of negative health impacts of, say, overconsumption of food. And I'll leave you with the call that if we want to have an impact, then it's the everyday norms and expectations of how we live our lives. Our everyday consumption really matters here, and there's lots of opportunity to make a significant impact by starting with the way that we all think about living our everyday lives. Lots of opportunity to change. Thank you very much. The final slide is just a list of references from today's presentation, and I invite you to look at some of those if you're interested. Thanks very much.